This paper is from my colleague, John Fitzgibbon, who's based at Boston College, and me, based at the University of Surrey. What we wanted to do with this paper, we wanted more to look at the way that Euroscepticism has changed. John generally works on civil society opposition to the European Union, and generally work on public opinion and European integration. And what we both noticed was the way that already we couldn't so much use the soft and hard framework to understand opposition to the European Union, but also the way that opposition to the European Union has changed. And it's nice that Duncan is here because I would refer a lot to his book and his work in this paper. So what we wanted to do and look at was at the time of the 2019 elections, at the way there was a proper mobilization across parties, but often at the previous elections, for instance, in Italy, at the sort of zenith of the financial crisis, a mobilization of public opinion against the European Union. So we wanted to look at the way that the idea of Europe has changed and the way that it has been framed differently, and what issues can mobilize public opinion and what issues political parties can use. Because these, most recently, for instance, Taru Appala and Alvaro Leat have written a book on the politicization of Europe. It has been used not so much by public opinion, political parties. It is politicized at the parliament's level. So the way that at the very beginning, when Peter Mayer in the early 2000s was writing that there was not an arena to discuss and politicize Europe, well, he could not imagine what has happened in the next 10, 20 years, when actually we have had the financial crisis, we have had COVID as well, and where we are now talking about, for instance, of the recovery fund and how these, for instance, are delivered to illiberal states and might reinforce, for instance, corrupt network at the national state. So the idea was starting from Salvini, and this idea of uniting transnationally across Europe, this opposition towards the European Union. So without looking at populism or without looking at the radical right, we are interested in looking what can mobilize parties and public opinion on specific issues towards the European Union. So if in a way it is illogical for a sovereignist or for a type of radical right parties to mobilize, and as we have seen, there are tropes that works and travel, or Euroscepticism is not determinant, as Duncan has found, but in a way it is, and it becomes an issue that can mobilize. So what we did at the time, we look at the 2017 Chapel Hill data, and I need to look at this with the 2019, by using the ones that were existing in the early years when Salvini started to think about this transnational mobilization. We find that there are issues like, for instance, corruption, looking at the European Union as a non-transparent organization, and also an economic European Union. Oliver Tribe has looked at the way that the European Union and opposition is differently seen by mainstream right and radical right parties. But it's interesting the way that it can be mobilized on similar issues and can be mobilized by left-wing parties as well, on corruptions and unaccountable type of organization, but also on the way that, for instance, at the moment, there are issues around the way the funds are distributed. And then we want to introduce, the idea was to offer a new concept that already Donatella Della Porta, for instance, talk about in the early 2000s when looking, for instance, at social movements. She used Euro-critical movements. We want to use Euroalternativism as a way that John already talked about in the case of Ireland, and looking at grassroots organization and other organizations than in Estonia and in Denmark as well in his research design, where there is an opposition to the European Union, not specifically on some policies, but where there is a pro-EU attitude to the idea of Europe, of having an organization as the European Union, pro-systemic. So they don't oppose the European Union, as Beppe Grillo, the leader of the Five-Star Movement, said. We never said that we wanted to leave the European Union when Farage and UKIP, then the UK voted to leave the European Union. We just want to change Europe. So this sort of pro-systemic opposition, how can it be mobilized? So what we do, we look at the literature and we start from Peter May's argument that there was not a sort of a way to mobilize against European integration. But the way that Europe has changed, and the way that, for instance, there is a systemic control, for instance, of monetary union, can mobilize both on the left and the right. What is a challenge, and Chris Flood already saw that, is the way that it is criticized in different ways by the right and the left. And actually Oliver Tribe found it is criticized differently also by the mainstream right and the extreme right. But we also see the Euroscepticism now exists everywhere. So if you look at party systems, you find that is also present across the mainstream. So there is no more, also the ones who support the European Union now criticize the European Union on issues. So we think that the hard and soft, both for political parties, and it never really worked for public opinion or civil society, is not very useful to understand how we see the European Union today. So in the parliament, and not just the European Parliament, Euroscepticism has changed, and there have been explanations on how we can explain party families, and I have Duncan's book here at the back. And what we have found, actually, we have found that it is changed also in the way that party groups unite in the parliament. And Salvini, actually, for once, is never, almost never successful strategically at times. What he does before the 2019 elections, he has found an opportunity to unite transnationally, and we think that actually it was quite a sound decision, even though we could think it was illogical. So what we think that we can understand Euroscepticism as opposition in a new way, and this pro-systemic opposition, we call it Euroalternativism. So another idea of Europe, another Europe is possible from the social movements that Della Porta studied, where we can have a hard Euroscepticism, but Paul Taggart looked at the new parliament and actually found that once Brexit left the European Parliament, there is not so much hard Euroscepticism even in the European Parliament. So a type of what we called withdrawalist Euroscepticism doesn't exist much. what we need to focus on and what we need to work on is how this opposition can be constructed, on what issues. And there is a Euroscepticism from the right and a Euroscepticism from the left. So we suggest a Euroalternativism that can become progressive in some cases when it comes from the left, or alt-Euralternativism when it's more the sovereignist ones and comes from type of Salvini or type of Meloni or Vox or type of radical right. What we did with the 2017, I looked at Euroscepticism before in the paper. I look at all the parties and their positions on specific issues that in the paper of Duncan and Werner and the book, they also look, but there was the paper on the Journal of Public Policy in particular, they look at these issues. But what I wanted to look at, I didn't want to look at specific right or specific left. And in particular, I have some parties that I'm challenged to see as just right or left. In Italy, for instance, the 5-star movement. In some cases, Criesi talks about a left-wing type of party. I've always been skeptical on a left position, and also it incorporates in interviews with them. I've met people that previously voted yes for communist refundation, but in other cases for the Democratic Party, in other cases for Forza Italia, in other cases with more right-wing parties in Italy. So it has brought together different types of ideologies, and therefore, as it was described by Ivo Diamanti in Italy, it is more like a bus where both members and voters step on and different bus stops, and it changes all the times. So I brought all these parties together, and I have recorded the position on Europe, where we have more Euroscepticism as a binary dependent variable as one. And I look at what type of issues can mobilize parties, can be used by parties strategically to mobilize transnationally. And I find that this corruption is actually an important one, and the EU budget is an important one. And these can be mobilized by both the right and the left, because on the right, it can be mobilized, for instance, on protecting national sovereignty. Think about when they were discussing support at time of COVID, the frugals against the others, and particular Merkel's positions. And then when I cut on some of these variables, I find that the EU budget is the only one that remains. It explains, the model explains less, of course, but remains the one that also takes more, gains more importance on mobilizing on Euroscepticism. So the economic side of Europe is actually an issue that, as we have seen also in the previous paper, that can mobilize both on the right and on the left. And it's interesting that there is a multicultural Europe that becomes important, and it has a negative relations, which means that for left-wing parties or progressive parties, Fortress Europe doesn't work. And this is interesting because actually in interviews with the 5-star movement, their idea of Europe was a Europe that was helping poorer states. And they were saying, we just don't want to represent Europeans. And I'm finishing. And they wanted to represent actually also, they were thinking, for instance, the Eurozone or Europe, and Europe as an economic Europe was also, for instance, a Europe that or on development is a Europe that actually doesn't help third countries. So their idea was, we just don't want to protect citizens from the international organizations in Europe, but we want to protect also people outside of Europe. And they were talking about mostly from South, the global South. So the idea is that there is and there are transnational issues can be articulated and can mobilized around Europe. And we find the economic Europe or corruption or unaccountability or non-transparency are issues that can be mobilized, and we refer to the literature and of course, as I said, Duncan, but also the special issues on politics by Pirro and the others in 2018. And there is a way to mobilize that can be mobilized on the right, can be mobilized on the left, or can find an alliance in the parliament. And we often see these in the parliament, where there are members from the extreme left voting together with the extreme right. And therefore, going back to our question on how logical it was for Salvini to mobilize on Europe, we think that actually it was a good idea to mobilize on Europe, and it's becoming more important because there is more politicization of Europe, as we have found. So even though it can seem illogical, then they need to, if they want, they can find a way to mobilize around issues of unaccountability, while progressives can use a multiculturalism and the idea of Europe embracing different culture. And here I offer a Salvini dancing to thank you for the attention, and it was a pleasure to be with you. Thanks a lot for inviting me.